The recent resurfacing of allegations against former President Lyndon B. Johnson, L.B.J., and his ties to Malcolm Mac Wallace has reignited a decades-old debate about political conspiracies, murder, and the deep-seated corruption of American institutions. In a recording recently released by Billie Sol Estes' grandson, it is claimed that L.B.J. orchestrated a series of murders, including the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, to consolidate his political power. Hello, and welcome back to my channel. And if you're new, then I'm Jess Cannell. I'd like to welcome you, and I'd like to earn your subscription. Well, today we are going down a rabbit trail that I love to go down, which is the JFK assassination. And it is such a timely topic because we have all sorts of things actually happening in our culture to support that exploration. So the thing that I'm getting into actually happened before President Trump's executive order. So if you came thinking, oh, maybe there's some new documents, it's not that. However, this happened, I want to say about a week before he signed that order. And so I want to get into it with you. Well, first I have to level with you. I heard about this, I believe, through a viewer. And when I went to listen to it, it seemed highly credible. One of the things that seemed highly credible about this audio that we are going to talk about today is the accent, actually. Some of you have seen segments where I've gone through Penn Jones' documents, Forgive My Grief. He was an early JFK official narrative questioner, and he lived in the Dallas area. So he had access to a lot of the witnesses, and he just, over decades as a newspaperman, sought out people and followed leads. Well, as I've listened to him, that's the thing that actually made me think that the audio that we're going to talk about is legit. People question, like, could this be legit? We're going to get into it. But the accent was the thing that got me. So I went looking online to see if I could find a credible, reputable newspaper or news source of any kind that had discussed this audio, because surely, since it happened in mid-January before the exchange of presidents, and since it's such a potentially explosive audio, I thought surely someone had picked it up. Well, the only thing I found was a paper that seems to be maybe an online publication. I actually haven't looked into the credibility of this, but I will say we are going to use it as a jumping off place. And then we are going to fill in the gaps with various articles I have printed from NBC News, other sources, Los Angeles Times, etc. But this is the article that we are going to talk about. It is from the Dallas Express, which calls itself the People's Paper. Again, this is not like the Dallas Times Herald. It's not some sort of paper that I've heard of as a in the Dallas area resident, but she does a great job. It's Sarah Zubiet Bennett. She says she's the co-founder and director. She does a great job of summarizing what we're going to talk about today. And so we're going to use this as a jumping off place. Here's the headline. Explosive audio. Did L.B.J. kill JFK? The recent resurfacing of allegations against former President Lyndon B. Johnson, L.B.J., and his ties to Malcolm Mac Wallace has reignited a decades-old debate about political conspiracies, murder, and the deep-seated corruption of American institutions. In a recording recently released by Billie Sol Estes' grandson, it is claimed that L.B.J. orchestrated a series of murders, including the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, to consolidate his political power. These claims are based on never-before-heard audio of Clifton Carter, the former executive director of the Democratic National Committee and close associate of L.B.J., admitting that L.B.J. hired Mac Wallace to assassinate JFK. If true, these allegations suggest not just a betrayal in the 1960s, but a continued legacy of corruption within government agencies that persists today. Okay, we're going to pause it right there, and we're going to talk just about what we've just heard. So first of all, LBJ. It's not a new accusation that potentially he had something to do with it. I mean, that's kind of like first line police work, right? Is who would benefit from this person's murder? And so most clearly of anybody would be LBJ. And so he's certainly been in contention or consideration over decades for, did he have something to do with it? Did he give a head nod? Was he actually involved? Did he kind of tip off that he wouldn't be sad? Like, exactly to what degree, right, might he have played a part? That's one of the questions in consideration here. Another question in consideration is, who is this Mac Wallace figure? We're going to get into that today. In fact, he's the centerpiece of this talk. The other thing that we need to talk about is Billie Sol Estes. So Billie Sol Estes was a person who was connected with LBJ in a number of ways, which we'll get into. And it's his grandson who released this audio. Here is that audio.
Well, Sol, it's been pretty touch and go situation. Linda and I have had quite a few unpleasant words here lately over the deal with that he hired Mike Wallace to assassinate the president. It's been hectic in every way, but we've lived through it this far, and I guess we'll continue to do so. Lyndon should have never issued that order to Mike, but we've had our differences, and I'm a true blue to Lyndon, as I've always been, and tried to carry out every order that he'd ever given me. But this is one I'll probably never be able to forget. And the times that we've had in Texas, and the embarrassment that Lyndon had gotten from Kennedy, I guess there wasn't anything else to do but what he did.
Well, you know, Lyndon said it really hit me if he would.
Lyndon's the kind of person that doesn't want to help anyone. He's all for Lyndon, and that's the way he's pretty much always been.
So it is two men, Billie Sol Estes and Clifton Carter, both of whom were LBJ associates, discussing a variety of topics. And one of the things that is sort of like known information between them is that LBJ hired this person, Mac Wallace, to assassinate Kennedy. And that because at the moment of the recording, apparently LBJ was nearing death. And they both indicated that part of why he was in such turmoil had to do with the weight of the various deaths that he had ordered. And they list them out. It's very explosive. It's very interesting. And I'd encourage you to spend some time, listen to it, and then even listen to it again. Pay attention to little nuances, the random things they talk about. This is not, now we have this question of, is it AI? Is it actually them? Is it Billie Sol Estes, pretending, but it's not actually Clifton Carter on the other side? I think the things that they know about and the things that they each relate back and forth seem very conversational, very high level, very specific, and it has every indication of being authentic. Furthermore, Dallas Express tells us a source who was close personal friends of Sol Estes spoke to Dallas Express on deep background to protect their identity because they have been harassed for years by the DOJ. The Dallas Express source verified that Sol Estes shared the same exact story as the recording captured with him personally. So this is someone who spoke to Billie Sol Estes, who is now speaking to the publisher of this story, saying, he told me the exact same story, and that the voice heard on the tape was in fact Sol Estes. Photos of the source that she is referencing with Sol Estes, as well as handwritten notes between the two of them, were shared with Dallas Express. The source claimed that they spoke for hundreds of hours and that Sol Estes' story never changed or had any inconsistencies. So I kind of wanted to get into that a little bit. And one book that I found, it's called Faustian Bargains, and it's a book about Lyndon Johnson and Mac Wallace in the robber baron culture of Texas. This book was published in 2016 by Joan Mellon, and she gives this background, and I am just going to read it. It is a summary of her book. But it's important because it gives several different pieces of information that will help us in our discovery of who is this Billie Sol Estes figure and who is this Mac Wallace figure, and how are either of them related to LBJ and potentially to the JFK assassination. Perhaps no president has a more ambiguous reputation than LBJ. A brilliant tactician, he maneuvered colleagues and turned bills into law better than anyone. But he was trailed by a legacy of underhanded dealings, from his stolen Senate election in 1948 to kickbacks he artfully concealed from deals engineered with Texas wheeler-dealer Billie Sol Estes and defense contractors. On the verge of investigation, Johnson was reprieved when he became president upon JFK's assassination. We're going to talk about that investigation, so hang tight on that. I realize we are just building pieces, but what I'm trying to do is use this article as the hinge point on which we're going to pull in other evidence from other sources to make a final conclusion about Mac Wallace and his potential involvement with the JFK assassination. Among the mysteries has been LBJ's relationship to Mac Wallace, who in 1951 shot a Texas man having an affair with LBJ's loose cannon sister, also Wallace's lover. Okay, that is complex, but Mac Wallace was the lover of LBJ's sister, we're being told. And also, she was having another affair for which LBJ hired Mac Wallace to kill that man. Okay, and he did. When arrested, Wallace coolly said, "I work for Johnson. I need to get back to Washington." Charged with murder, he was overnight defended by LBJ's powerful lawyer, John Cofer, and though convicted, amazingly received a suspended sentence. Who do you know that's a murderer that doesn't even care and says, "I need to get back to Washington," is defended by a high-power lawyer overnight, no less, and is convicted and yet suspended sentence granted for that murder? He then got a high security clearance from LBJ friend and defense contractor D.H. Byrd, which the Office of Naval Intelligence tried for 11 years to revoke without success. So that's what this book is about. And I will just tell you, she has a list of the table of contents. And as you go along, you not only get into the relationship between Mac Wallace and LBJ, but the final chapter is called The Fingerprint. That is where we are headed. That is the important information that connects all of it with the JFK assassination. Back to our Dallas Express article, the possibility that LBJ, the former vice president and eventual president, played a role in JFK's assassination is not a new theory. But the involvement of Mac Wallace as his alleged right-hand man has brought a chilling new dimension to the narrative. Now, interestingly, this audio specifically links not just LBJ to the JFK assassination, but links this man named Mac. That Billie Sol Estes specifically says that LBJ hired Mac to kill JFK, and that now he's suffering for the effects of having played a part in this many murders. The article continues, if these allegations hold any truth, it would signify one of the darkest and most audacious coups in American history, a deliberate attempt to undermine the Republic from within. She also makes the connection that President Trump, the now President Trump, which he was not president at the time that this article was written, it was written January 15th, 2025, that Donald Trump and Donald Trump Jr. have both been shown evidence of these claims, possibly in the form of recordings. The question arises then, if these conspiracies were successfully executed, then does the alleged conspiracy continue to haunt America? These are the questions with the LBJ, Mac Wallace, JFK link. Now we're going to get into one critical piece of information before we get into who is Mac Wallace. This piece of information is that in the very first phone call between L.B.J. and J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI, the actual audio was lost. But when in 1993 we had the JFK movie released and there was a big push in Congress to go ahead and release all the documents, at that point it had been over 30 years. And one of the things that was released was a document that was the transcript of the very first phone call that LBJ had with Hoover, the FBI director. And in that phone call, they expressed, for one, they already knew quite a number of things about Lee Harvey Oswald. They seemed to have already been tracking him and be up to speed about many of his recent potential goings on, including a trip that is disputed about whether or not Lee Harvey Oswald was even there in Mexico City. Keep up with me though. Let's not get off on the Lee Harvey Oswald track. Let's just keep going. They already had information about Lee Harvey Oswald though. That was significant. But the other thing is that they seemed very insistent that we need to make sure that the American people believe that there was just one shooter. Now, is that a smoking gun? No. Does that mean that they for sure knew that there, were more gunmen and they were trying to deceive? It does not mean that. But it is like a little indicator of are they saying that because they just don't want the American people to get sucked into various narratives? Or are they saying that because they know there is further information and they know they need to lock down other further information and just make the lone gunman theory? This article in NBC News from 2017 by Alex Johnson says that the quote from Hoover dictating in a memo that 2 days after JFK's assassination, on the day that Jack Ruby killed Lee Harvey Oswald, he said on this dictation, so you can just picture Hoover dictating this word, he said, "There is nothing further on the Oswald case except that he is dead." Hoover appeared to be particularly concerned that the public would have to be compelled to believe that Oswald was a lone actor, not part of a larger conspiracy. He then dictated, "The thing I am concerned about, and so is Mr. Katzenbach, who was the deputy AG at the time, is having something issued so we can convince the public that Oswald is the real assassin." There's a few things in that quote that are interesting. The thing I am concerned about. So he's concerned. This is 2 days after the JFK assassination. Why would he be concerned about this? So that we can convince the public that Oswald is the real assassin. If you have all the evidence, lay it out. It's pretty plain. When there is a clear, this person did that, and there's as much documentation as was, even in 1963, the amount of documentation that was happening at Dealey Plaza is pretty phenomenal, to be honest. You had a newspaper right around the corner. You had a bunch of newspapermen who arrived on the scene within minutes. You have a lot of documentation. It should be pretty obvious, should be pretty cut and dry. It's not clear from the memo, NBC News goes on, whether Hoover thought there might have been a conspiracy but didn't want it to be known, or whether he sincerely believed Oswald acted alone and hoped to head off public fear and confusion. Hoover also indicated that his concern may have been influenced in part by diplomacy, dictating that there could be serious international complications if the public thought Oswald might have been part of a larger plot. Yes, indeed. That part totally makes sense. That they did not want people to think, well, Oswald used to be in Russia, so did Russia have something to do with this? They didn't want to get into an actual hot war when they were still roughly in a Cold War. Well, the other thing that I want to talk about is that Congresswoman Anna Paulina Luna from Florida has just been appointed the head of a task force for the declassification of federal secrets. And in her initial introduction to even the idea of this task force, she indicated that she had seen information and that it wouldn't be long before we would see it that gives clear indication of 2 shooters in the JFK assassination. 2. And so we don't know whether or not Lee Harvey Oswald is being indicated at that point as one of those 2 shooters. It is possible he's not. I actually have seen enough information about his positioning at the lunch table and the timing of when Kennedy was supposed to go by versus when Lee Harvey Oswald was still visibly seen by another worker at the cafeteria table at the moment when JFK was supposed to have gone by, which seems like a really faulty plan. If you're going to assassinate somebody, you need to be in position, right? It's like, did he just up and decide in 8 seconds and go do it and then run down? And he was seen right after, 90 seconds after the assassination, he was seen there. So I personally have good reason to believe, or I feel that I do, that Lee Harvey Oswald was not one of the shooters at all. But let's assume that perhaps he was. Even still, if there are 2 shooters, then we have one other shooter that we are specifically looking for at this point. And that's why we're here talking about Mac Wallace. So Spartacus Educational Online has a bunch of character descriptions and resources available if you are interested in researching the JFK assassination. They have compiled just heaps and heaps and heaps of files and documents and even coalesced them all so that you get these topical articles. And this one is about Malcolm Mac Wallace. I'm not going to read all of it, but he was Texas born and raised. He joined the Marines, and in less than a year, he was medically discharged and returned to Dallas. He became a student at the University of Texas in Austin. While he was working on his doctorate at Columbia University, he came in contact with a man named Edward Clark, who introduced him to Lyndon Johnson. In 1950, he began working with the United States Department of Agriculture in Texas, and he began having an affair with LBJ's sister. She was also having a relationship with a man named John Kinzer, the owner of a golf course in Austin. Kinzer asked her to approach her brother for financial help. When Johnson refused, it's believed that Kinzer resorted to blackmail, at which point, according to McClellan, the author of a book called Blood, Money, and Power, How L.B.J. Killed JFK, Kinzer asked her if she could arrange for her brother to loan him some money. Johnson interpreted this as a blackmail threat. On 22nd of October, 1951, Mac Wallace went to Kinzer's miniature golf course. After finding Kinzer in his golf shop, he shot him several times before escaping in his station wagon. A customer at the golf course heard the shooting and managed to remember Wallace's license plate. The local police force was then able to track Wallace and arrest him. Wallace was charged with murder, but later released on bail after Edward Clark arranged for 2 of Johnson's financial supporters to post bonds on behalf of the defendant. Johnson's attorney, John Cofer, also agreed to represent Wallace. On the 1st of February 1952, he resigned from government in order to distance himself from Lyndon Johnson. His trial began 17 days later. Wallace did not testify. Cofer admitted his client's guilt, but claimed it was an act of revenge as Kinzer had been sleeping with Wallace's wife. So they made up a totally different story, that it was an act of passion. The jury found him guilty of murder with malice aforethought. That's the title of the actual charge. 11 of the jurors were for the death penalty. The 12th argued for life imprisonment. So after hearing the entire case, 12 of his peers judged guilty with murder with malice aforethought, and 11 of them wanted him dead for it. But that's how strongly his peers judged him. The 12th said life imprisonment would be enough. Judge Charles O. Betts overruled the jury and announced a sentence of 5 years imprisonment. Then he suspended the sentence, and Wallace was immediately freed. According to Bill Adler of the Texas Observer, several of the jurors telephoned John Kinzer's parents to apologize for agreeing to a suspended sentence, but said they did so only because threats had been made against their families. So there's all sorts of underhand dealings there. Well, in 1960, Henry Marshall was asked by the Agricultural Adjustment Administration to investigate the activities of Billie Sol Estes. Estes had purchased different cotton allotments. We're not going to get into the details, but they get in this back and forth, and there's the assumption that Billie Sol Estes had friends in high places. There were schemes, there were devices being used, prosecution was being avoided. Johnson suggests that Marshall is going to be promoted out of Texas, and Estes agrees. He says, let's transfer him, get him out of here so he's not in this area at all. So Estes, Johnson, and Carter have another meeting to discuss what to do about Henry Marshall. Also at this meeting was Mac Wallace. After it was pointed out that Marshall had refused the promotion to Washington, Johnson said, it looks like we'll just have to get rid of him. Wallace, who Estes described as a hitman, was given the assignment. On the 3rd of June, 1961, Marshall was found dead on his farm by the side of his Chevy Fleetside pickup truck. His rifle lay beside him. He had been shot 5 times with his own rifle. Soon after, county sheriff arrived. He decreed that Marshall had committed suicide. No pictures were taken, no blood samples were taken, no check for fingerprints were made. Billie Sol Estes later told the grand jury that he met Mac Wallace and Clifton Carter at his home in Pecos after Henry Marshall was killed. Wallace described how he waited for Marshall at his farm. He planned to kill him and make it appear as if Marshall committed suicide by carbon monoxide poisoning. However, Marshall fought back, and he was forced to shoot him with his own rifle. He quoted Carter as saying that Wallace sure did botch it up. Johnson was now forced to use his influence to get the authorities in Texas to cover up the murder. Marshall's wife and brother refused to believe that he had taken his own life and posted a $2,000 reward for information leading to a murder conviction. The undertaker reported also, to me it looked like murder. I just do not believe a man could shoot himself like that. In the end, the judge said that he put suicide on the death certificate because the sheriff told him to. Death by gunshot, self-inflicted. So now we have for sure 2 known situations where Mac Wallace committed murder in connection with L.B.J. In the spring of 1962, Billie Sol Estes, who I remind you is in the audio that we started out discussing from the very beginning, he was arrested by the FBI on fraud and conspiracy charges. On the 4th of April, his chief accountant was found dead. Despite a severe bruise on his head, the coroner decided that he also had committed suicide. The next day, Estes and 3 business associates were indicted by a federal grand jury on 57 counts of fraud. 2 of these men, called Harold Orr and Coleman Wade, died before the case ever came to court. So at this point, there's potentially 3, 4, 5, just in the sections that we read. I actually, there's whole sections of this article that I'm not reading. I'm just trying to give you the connecting points between Billie Sol Estes, Mac Wallace, and L.B.J. so that you can decide for yourself what to do with this information. At the time, it was said that they took their own lives, but later Estes was to claim that both men were murdered by Mac Wallace in order to protect the political career of L.B.J. The Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations also began to look into the case of Billie Sol Estes. It was eventually discovered that 3 officials had received bribes from Billie Sol Estes. Red Jacobs, Jim Ralph, and Bill Morris, all with the Agriculture Administration in Washington, were eventually removed from their jobs, but the cover-up continued. In June 1962, Billie Sol Estes appeared before the grand jury. His trial began in October of 1962. John Cofer, remember that same lawyer from L.B.J. who had gone to represent Mac Wallace, he refused to put Estes on the witness stand, and Estes was found guilty of fraud and sentenced to 8 years in prison. Federal proceedings against Estes began in March 1963. He was eventually charged with fraud regarding mortgages of more than $24 million. Estes was found guilty and sentenced to 15 years in prison. The Permanent Investigations Committee continued to look into the case of Billie Sol Estes, and President John F. Kennedy now began considering dropping L.B.J. as his running mate in the next presidential election. He had been discussing this for months, but he began to discuss it much more openly, and rumors began to circulate that Terry Sanford of North Carolina would be the next vice president. According to McClellan, it was now decided by Edward Clark that the investigation into Billie Sol Estes and Bobby Baker had to be brought to an end. Now we have a new person. And y'all, I get it. These are, for me, this is why it's helpful for me to read with you guys, because when I read these things just in my own head without context, I start to get lost in who's who and where they fall. But I happen to have 2 Life magazines that will help us with the question of who is Bobby Baker. In these 2 Life printings, this one is the one that is literally November 22nd, 1963. Yes, somebody has drawn a face on this, so if you see that, it's just for some kid probably in the 1970s that did it. But this was the printing of Life magazine the very day that JFK was assassinated. And this is the one from 2 weeks prior, November 8th, 1963. And on it, you can see the Bobby Baker bombshell. I want to read this whole article with you guys sometime. But Bobby Baker, my understanding is that it says capital buzzes over stories of misconduct in high places. And then it's actually followed up on in this printing, which is why I want to show you both of these. That literally in the 2 weeks prior to JFK's assassination, these things were being talked about to a degree that they headlined Life magazine. Bobby Baker was an associate of LBJ's, who my understanding is he was basically running a high-end call girl hotel situation just outside of Washington, D.C. that would have implicated a lot of people in high places, congressmen, senators, L.B.J. himself, and that was the buzz. Literally, I mean, you see that capital buzzes, right? That's the articles that were being printed and discussed right about the time that JFK is already talking about getting L.B.J. off of the ticket. Then that's happening with an L.B.J. associate, and also this Billie Sol Estes has just been found guilty that year. So do you see all the pieces coming together? I hope you do. We're told in this article from Spartacus Educational, it says, McClellan claims that Clark recruited Wallace, so that's Edward Clark, which is LBJ's lawyer, recruited Wallace to organize the assassination of John F. Kennedy. When Johnson became president, he managed to bring an end to the Senate investigations into Estes and Baker. So after he's president, he shuts down the Bobby Baker investigation. He shuts down the Billie Sol Estes investigation. McClellan later claimed that the killing of Kennedy was paid for by oil millionaires such as Clint Murchison and Harold Hunt, both of whom were in Dallas on the night of the assassination. And Hunt had a suite that looked out over Dealey Plaza. There have been contentions by some that a shooter might have taken aim from either that suite, which is directly behind where the car was, or from the roof above. I haven't seen enough evidence of that. I have heard reports of meetings that took place in Hunt's apartment there on Dealey Plaza that give me pause and give me reason to think that these things are connected. Wallace went to work for Harry Lewis and L&G Oil, and in 1970, he returned to Dallas and began pressing Edward Clark for more money for his part in the assassination of John F. Kennedy. According to McClellan, it was then decided to kill Wallace. He had to be eliminated. After driving to see his daughter in Troop, Texas, he went by L&G's offices in Longview. There, his exhaust was rigged for part of it to flow into his car. On the 7th of January, 1971, Malcolm Wallace was killed while driving into Pittsburgh, Texas. He appeared to have fallen asleep and after leaving the road, crashed his car. He died of massive head injuries. Soon afterwards, Clifton Carter, the other voice on that recording, died at age 53. 1971 was also the year that Billie Sol Estes was due to leave prison. According to Clint Peoples, a Texas Ranger based in Austin, Billie Sol Estes had promised to tell the full story of the death of Henry Marshall when he obtained his freedom. And in 1984, Estes's, so this is Billie Sol Estes, the voice in the recording, let me remind you, his lawyer wrote to Stephen Trott at the U.S. Department of Justice. In the letter, he claimed that Wallace, so Mac Wallace, Billie Sol Estes, L.B.J., and Cliff Carter, the other voice on the recording, okay? So Mac Wallace, the one that we've been talking about that actually did the assassination, L.B.J., president, and then the two voices on the audio recording had been involved in the murders of Henry Marshall, George Krutalik, which is the accountant, Harold Orr, Ike Rogers, Coleman Wade, LBJ's sister, John Kinzer, the one that she was having the affair with, and John F. Kennedy. Caddy added, this is the lawyer for Billie Sol Estes in 1984, he said, Mr. Estes is willing to testify that LBJ ordered these killings and that he transmitted his orders through Clifton Carter to Mac Wallace, who executed the murders. So all of this was said and done in 1984, which was two decades, more than 2 decades after JFK had been assassinated. We have other people saying, remember in the original article that we read, that Billie Sol Estes' story never changed, that he said the same throughout. Now, I have one more piece of information that I haven't yet tipped my hand to, and those of you who are familiar with the case already know it. But in 1998, there was a press conference held in Dallas to discuss a previously unidentified fingerprint. This fingerprint had been found in the sniper's nest at the Texas School Book Depository, okay? It was there, you know, we hear about the sniper's nest. There were stacks of boxes around that kind of blocked the view from one side of the building because where they are in that building is literally a corner. And so there was a whole row of windows here. So the boxes would have kind of given them cover from various angles and let them get right in by the window close. It would have also protected them if somebody happened to be going up and down the stairs potentially. That's the thinking there. So there are all these boxes, and they had found one fingerprint. It did not match Lee Harvey Oswald. It didn't match anybody in the building. It didn't match any known person. They did database searches. They could not find this fingerprint. In 1998, they hold a press conference. And this, according to Brown, had now been identified as belonging to none other than Mac Wallace. So Mac Wallace was the owner of the fingerprint that was there in the 6th floor depository. Isn't that interesting? We're going to read a section of an article from Vanity Fair now from June 2008. It also indicates LBJ's lawyer, Edward Clark, enlisted hitman Mac Wallace as the second JFK gunman in Dallas, largely based on a single indistinct fingerprint smudge found in the Texas School Book Depository. Clark purportedly received a deferred $2 million payoff for helping maneuver LBJ into the Oval Office. The other piece of information that I wanted to share with you from this Vanity Fair article is in a subsequent History Channel documentary called The Guilty Men, a woman named Madeline Brown, who was allegedly a longtime LBJ mistress, asserts that in November 1963, the vice president told her the night before JFK's assassination, "Those blankety-blank Kennedys will never embarrass me again. That's no threat. That's a promise." So we have LBJ's potential mistress giving us that little tidbit. The final thing that this article in the Dallas Express does is she actually brings it back to the city of Dallas. She says, it has been over 60 years since President Kennedy's assassination in Dallas, and the city has long struggled to reconcile its association with that tragic day. What if Dallas wasn't at fault at all? What if the true culpability lies with Lyndon B. Johnson, whose name adorns one of the city's most prominent freeways? It really does. We have the LBJ freeway right here in Dallas. If these allegations prove true, it may be time for Dallas to reconsider how it memorializes LBJ. And I just wanted to share with you, because I haven't ever shared on this channel, there is a man, I did a little feature video with him, named Ron Washington. He does Dealey Plaza tours every day down there in Dealey Plaza. But my point in sharing this with you, he has this little booklet that he sells that gives photographs and evidence and locations of various elements involved in the assassination. But my point in sharing this is the JFK assassination and the city of Dallas go hand in hand. It is one of our biggest tourist locations here in Dallas. People flock from all over the world to see that little piece of land. And what she says is right. that for 61, almost 62 years now, the city of Dallas has had negative associations, that we're just an evil place, that we're a right-wing place, that there was so much anger and hostility, that it was the people of Dallas that were like boiling over into a fervor. I don't know if any of you have ever read Stephen King's novel about the JFK assassination. It's actually really fascinating. It's kind of a little bit sci-fi, a little bit history, and it's a wonderful novel. I've read it many times. It's very thick, but very high-paced and fascinating. But one of the things that you find in that novel is this like fomenting, just foaming at the mouth anger of Dallas that in his contention is the source of, it's like the wellspring that finally boiled over and ended up pushing Oswald to commit the murder. In this article, which I'll remind you was released 5 days before Trump took office, now we know that he has already signed the executive order, but she calls him to do so, to release the files. And she says the ties between power, corruption, and secrecy must be exposed to prevent future abuses. As new information surfaces, the American public must demand accountability and transparency. If the claims about LBJ and his alleged enforcer, Mac Wallace, are true, they represent a betrayal of the highest order, not just of a president, but of the entire nation. The time has come to confront these historical shadows, uncover the truth, and ensure that such a coup against the Republic can never happen again. And then she goes on to discuss the impact that would have on the city of Dallas if we did so. So these are the articles I had to present to you guys. I hope this has provided some interesting food for thought. I also think it's interesting that she lands in the same place that, if you remember, the documentary that we watched about Ruth Paine was put out by a man named Max Good. And he actually landed in the same place. He said, if these things are true, if our own government was monitoring Lee Harvey Oswald and that he had nothing to do with it, and yet the pieces were arranged to where he was the patsy, if that is true, then we have some things to reckon with as far as what kind of nation have we been living in. If this is true, that Mac Wallace, an associate, a known associate of LBJ, nobody denies that they have a connection, that had already gotten away with murder a couple of different times that we know of, and 3 different other times allegedly by the mouth of Billie Sol Estes, the same person who was the voice in that audio. If that is true, and Mac Wallace's fingerprint was found in the 6th floor depository, it's not a big leap to think that LBJ had something to do with it, that there was foreknowledge, that there was potentially arrangement involved. And if so, then our own history is different than the one that we have assumed that it is. It's important for us to reckon with these things. It's important for us to learn how to talk openly about things that we have been shamed for talking about previously. It is not conspiracy theory level to find that a known associate of LBJ who had committed murder and gotten away with it, who had security clearance, that his fingerprint was in the 6th floor depository is huge. But then when you pair that with audio from another known associate of LBJ talking with a third associate of LBJ about how they know that it was really awry whenever LBJ hired Mac Wallace to go do that shooting. When you put all those things together, that's quite a case, don't you think? So what do you think? Let me know in the comments. Do you think that Mac Wallace could be one of those 2 shooters that Anna Paulina Luna was talking about in her task force introduction? Is that possible? I want to hear from you in the comments. If you have additional articles, resources, I'll tell you, it is not easy to get information about Mac Wallace. There's not tons of articles that have been written. Like I said, I went looking for, a Wall Street Journal source talking about this audio that is potentially earth-shattering, right? That one of our own presidents was involved in the assassination of a second president. That's big information, and yet the article I could find talking about it was from the Dallas Express. So let me know what you think. Let me know what you believe. Share any resources you have, and I will look forward to all of it in the comments. You guys have a great day.